in the shifting landscape of our contemporary epoch, where the threads of tradition unravel and new forms of psychic expression struggle to weave themselves into the collective fabric. The phenomenon of tattooing has emerged among Gen Z not as a trivial adornment of the flesh, but as a profound gesture of the psyche striving for articulation. And it is here that we must pause to reflect on the archetypal substratum that gives rise to such visible, indelible markings on the skin. For in the permanence of the tattoo, there lies a paradoxical hunger for stability in an age of instability, a yearning for symbolic anchoring amidst the chaos of fluid identities, digital transience, and the incessant impermanence of virtual communication. And to interpret this correctly, we must return to the insight that the human being has always, across epochs, been driven by archetypal forces which manifest not only in dreams and myths, but in rituals of the body. For the skin itself becomes the page upon which the unconscious inscribes its hieroglyphs. And what we observe in Gen Z's tattoo culture is neither mere fashion nor a nihilistic whim, but the re-emergence of the archaic function of symbol making as a way to encounter the self. For symbols are not invented arbitrarily, but arise from the deep well of the collective unconscious as carriers of meaning, drawing forth the individual into communion with the transpersonal. And thus, when a young person imprints upon their skin an image of the snake, the eye, the rose, the constellation, or the ancestral script, it is not the ego alone speaking, but rather the archetypal imagination using the flesh as a canvas to externalize the psychic drama within, to give body to the ineffable, and to establish a dialogue between conscious identity and the unconscious, forces that seek embodiment. And in this sense, tattooing fulfills the same archetypal role as initiation scars in tribal societies, as the painted masks of shamans, as the ritual piercings of warriors. For these practices are not about superficial decoration, but about participation in myth, about making the invisible visible. And Gen Z, having been born into an age where traditional mythologies have withered and the great religious symbols no longer speak with convincing authority, must turn inward to rediscover their own pantheon of meaning, and finding the institutions silent or irrelevant, they return to the body itself as the altar, inscribing upon it the sigils of personal mythologies that still retain the living fire of archetypal resonance. And this should not be dismissed as narcissism, but recognized as a symptom of the deeper psychic condition of modern humanity, which has lost its myth and must create one anew. And so, in the proliferation of tattoos, we may glimpse not only individual idiosyncrasy, but also the collective cry for a new mythos adequate to the task of living in a fragmented world. For without symbols, the soul starves, and the unconscious, denied expression, grows restless and pathological. And it is far healthier to inscribe the symbol on the skin than to allow it to fester in neurosis. And if we examine the motifs Gen Z selects, we discover archetypes emerging in fresh garments. The serpent returns as a sign of transformation, and danger, the phoenix rises again as emblem of rebirth. Geometric mandalas mirror the psyches striving for wholeness. Celestial bodies signify the longing for cosmic belonging. Animals reappear as totems of instinct and guidance. And even the seemingly ironic or playful tattoos conceal the trickster archetype, mocking convention while secretly liberating the psyche from its rigidities. And these patterns, when seen en masse, suggest that Gen Z is engaged in a massive, unconscious project of archetypal resymbolization, each individual tattoo becoming a fragment of a collective dream, a dream that unfolds on millions of bodies at once, each skin carrying a glyph, a narrative thread in the great unfinished myth of our time. And thus, the tattooed body becomes a manuscript, a living codex through which the unconscious seeks to write itself back into history. And as with all archetypal manifestations, there is ambivalence. The symbol can liberate or possess, heal or wound, integrate or inflate the ego. And here lies the danger and promise of tattooing, for the archetype is numinous, filled with psychic energy, and to inscribe it on the body is to invite its power into daily life. And if the ego is not prepared to bear the weight of this energy, the tattoo may become a fetish, a compulsive mark devoid of integration, a possession rather than a liberation. But if approached with consciousness, with reverence for its meaning, then the tattoo can serve as a talisman guiding the individual toward individuation, toward the realization of the self. And it is here that the task of interpretation becomes crucial. For we must ask, why do these particular symbols surge forth now, in this historical moment, upon this particular generation, and what do they reveal about the psychic climate of our era? And to this question, the answer is manifold. For Gen Z inhabits a world saturated with images, yet devoid of stable symbols, surrounded by infinite representations, but lacking anchoring myths, overwhelmed by information, yet starving for wisdom. And in such a climate, the tattoo becomes not just an aesthetic preference, but a desperate act of grounding, of making one image endure when all others flicker and vanish in the digital torrent, and thus the skin becomes the last bastion of permanence, the one medium not subject to deletion, and the permanence of ink stands as an act of defiance against the ephemerality of screens, a protest against the disposability of meaning, a declaration that some images still matter enough to suffer pain for, to carry for life. And this gesture itself is archetypal, the willingness to suffer for the sake of symbol, for without sacrifice the symbol has no power. And the ritual of tattooing, with its needle-piercing flesh, with its blood and pain, reintroduces sacrifice into a culture that has sterilized and anesthetized nearly every rite. And thus Gen Z, knowingly or not, reinvents initiation through tattooing. Each session at the artist's table echoing the ancient rites of passage, where pain, blood, and scar marked the crossing from one state of being to another. And in this sense, every tattoo is an initiation, a ritual death of unmarked skin and a rebirth into a new identity inscribed with symbol. And because these initiations are chosen, not imposed, they express the modern search for agency in self-creation, the desire to craft one's own myth rather than inherit a dead one. And yet beneath this conscious agency lies the unconscious compulsion of archetypes demanding embodiment, so that even when a young person insists that a tattoo is merely for aesthetic reasons, the deeper psyche laughs at such rationalizations. For the aesthetic is itself the language of the archetype, and the archetype does not need conscious belief to operate. It acts regardless, shaping desire, compelling action, writing itself in skin whether acknowledged or not. And thus we see that the proliferation of tattoos is not accidental but symptomatic of a deeper psychic process unfolding in our collective life, one that demands our attention if we are to understand the movement of the unconscious in our time. For the archetypes never die, they only change their costumes. And today they wear ink, and yet we must recognize that this act of inscribing symbols upon the flesh is not merely personal but also profoundly collective. For even when an individual chooses a design they deem unique, the archetype within it resonates with countless others across time and space, binding them into a hidden brotherhood of meaning, so that the tattoo functions as a secret handshake of the unconscious, a silent recognition between strangers who carry on their skin the same serpent, the same rose, the same sun, and this kinship, though unspoken, fulfills the psychic hunger for belonging in a generation that often feels atomized and dislocated. And thus tattooing not only binds the individual to their own depths, but also to a community of symbolic kin, a tribe without borders, constituted not by geography but by the shared resonance of archetypal imagery. And this explains why so many tattoos are shared, repeated, echoed endlessly across bodies and cultures. For the archetype compels repetition. It insists on reappearing in manifold variations. And each variation is both personal and universal, a unique instantiation of the same eternal pattern. And herein lies the paradox that Jung himself observed in dreams and myths, that the most personal symbol is also the most universal, that what we believe to be ours alone is in fact the language of the collective unconscious. And so the young person who inks a small moon on their wrist may feel it to be a singular mark of identity, yet they are simultaneously enacting an ancient lunar archetype that has whispered through goddesses, cycles, and mysteries for millennia. And in this paradox lies the healing power of tattoos, for they reassure the individual that their personal struggles are not isolated but archetypal, that their pain and hope participate in something larger, and in feeling this participation they are less alone, more connected to the timeless drama of humanity. And this connection is what modern culture so desperately lacks, for in losing myth we have lost context. We have lost the sense that our joys and sorrows belong to an eternal story. And tattooing, however imperfectly, restores a fragment of that mythic sense by marking the body with symbols that endure, that testify, that whisper of something more than the fleeting ego. And though critics may deride tattoos as superficial, the psyche knows otherwise. The psyche recognizes its own handwriting upon the skin, and it breathes a little easier, knowing that it has found a way to speak. If, in the first movement of our inquiry, we discerned in the tattoos of Gen Z the resurgence of archetypal forces seeking embodiment through the medium of skin, we must now proceed to contemplate the psychic dynamics that underlie this phenomenon. For the archetype is not an inert image, but a living dynamism that shapes consciousness and compels symbolic expression. And the act of tattooing, far from being a superficial gesture, represents an ongoing negotiation between ego and unconscious, between the drive toward individuation and the pressures of collective adaptation. And here we must attend carefully to the paradoxes at play, for on the one hand tattoos assert individuality, the uniqueness of the marked body as distinct from the unmarked masses, and yet on the other hand they bind individuals into a larger symbolic community, echoing ancient tribes where scarification and body art signified membership and identity. And this tension between individuality and collectivity lies at the heart of the modern psyche, which oscillates between the longing for absolute uniqueness and the hunger for belonging. And the tattoo provides a ritual compromise by allowing the individual to select a personal motif that also resonates collectively, thus enacting in miniature the very drama of individuation, which Jung described not as a withdrawal into isolated selfhood, but as the realization of one's uniqueness in relation to the whole. And so when Gen Z tattoos proliferate, we are witnessing not merely aesthetic experimentation, but the psyche of a generation attempting to reconcile the opposites that tear it apart. For they live in an age defined by paradox, hyperconnection through digital networks, and profound loneliness in lived experience, boundless freedom of self-expression, and crushing anxiety of meaninglessness. infinite access to knowledge, and a pervasive sense of disorientation, and in such an environment, symbols become not luxuries but necessities, anchors that prevent the ego from being swept away in the flood of flux, and the tattoo, fixed and unyielding, becomes a psychic stabilizer, a point of reference amidst endless change, a reminder that one image, at least, will not vanish when the feed refreshes, and yet we must not overlook the shadow dimension of this phenomenon. For the archetype, when neglected, manifests destructively, and when over-identified with it, can inflate the ego beyond measure, and tattoos, carrying the numinous charge of archetypes, risk both dangers. On the one hand, the absence of symbolic consciousness can leave tattoos empty, mere repetitions of fashion that fail to nourish the psyche and reduce the archetype to commodity, while on the other hand, an over-attachment to the tattoo as a definitive self-image can ossify the personality, trapping the individual in a static identity that resists the natural process of transformation. And thus the tattoo must be integrated into the larger process of individuation, not idolized nor dismissed, but held as a symbol that points beyond itself. And here lies the responsibility of consciousness, to recognize that the tattoo is not the self but a signpost toward it, not the totality of meaning but one fragment in the ongoing dialogue between ego and unconscious. And when held in this way, tattoos become invaluable allies in the journey of self, for they externalize inner content in a way that makes it visible, tangible, and enduring, allowing the ego to confront, contemplate, and integrate what would otherwise remain hidden. And in this confrontation there is healing, for the psyche suffers when it remains opaque to itself, and every symbol brought into consciousness, whether through dream, art, or tattoo, lightens the burden of unconsciousness. And yet we must also recognize that the archetypal content being externalized by Gen Z's tattoos is not random but deeply reflective of the cultural moment. And thus the images that recur: snakes' eyes, celestial bodies, animals, ancestral scripts, mandalize must be read as fragments of a collective dream. A dream being dreamed by a generation tasked with navigating a world on the brink of transformation, ecological crisis, technological upheaval, and the collapse of old certainties, and the psyche, anticipating catastrophe and renewal, reaches instinctively for archetypes of death and rebirth, of protection and guidance, of wholeness and cosmic belonging. And so the tattooed phoenix is not just an aesthetic flourish, but an unconscious anticipation of collapse and regeneration. The snake not just an ornament, but a recognition of danger and metamorphosis. The mandala not just geometry, but a symbol of the wholeness that the fragmented psyche longs for. And in this way we see that the tattoos of Gen Z are prophetic, the unconscious speaking of what the conscious mind cannot yet fully articulate, pointing to the myth that has not yet been written but is in the process of emergence. And it is this myth, still gestating, that will define the coming age. And the tattoos are its heralds, its first visible fragments on the surface of bodies. And if we attend to them with symbolic consciousness, we may discern in their proliferation the outlines of the archetypal drama unfolding, the collapse of the old order, the confrontation with chaos, the struggle for renewal, the search for wholeness, the resacralization of the body as temple and altar, and the forging of community through shared symbols. And all this is occurring not in the lofty halls of philosophy, but in tattoo parlors, in apartments, in living rooms, in the quiet decision of a young person to mark their skin. And it is precisely this democratization of symbolic expression that reveals the vitality of the archetype, for it does not require institutions or doctrines to manifest. It bursts forth wherever the psyche seeks to speak, and in tattoos it has found a medium both primal and modern, both personal and collective, both painful and celebratory. And this duality mirrors the dual nature of archetypes themselves, which contain both light and shadow, destruction and creation, suffering and joy. And the tattoo ritual embodies this, for it requires pain to produce beauty, sacrifice to generate meaning, blood to consecrate symbol. And in this sense, every tattoo is a miniature rite of passage, a confrontation with mortality and limitation, a voluntary acceptance of suffering for the sake of a greater image. And such rites are precisely what modern culture has stripped away, leaving the psyche hungry and restless, and Gen Z refusing to starve, reinvents initiation with ink and needle, with skin and symbol, and though they may not name it as such, they are enacting the same archetypal pattern as their ancestors, and in doing so they keep alive the eternal drama of human becoming. If we have thus far traced in the tattoo practices of Gen Z both a resurgence of archetypal forces and the psychic negotiations between individuality and collectivity, between conscious choice and unconscious compulsion, we must now turn our gaze to the broader implications of this phenomenon for the future of culture and the destiny of the psyche. For the tattoo is not a trivial fad, but a symbolic eruption that signals the transformation of myth in our time. And to ignore its significance is to remain blind to the very movements of the unconscious that shape our collective fate. And therefore, we must ask, what does it mean that a generation increasingly inscribes its myth upon the skin rather than receiving it from tradition? That it chooses its symbols rather than inherits them? That it locates the sacred not in distant temples but in the immediacy of the body? And here we see nothing less than the decentralization of mythic authority, the collapse of grand narratives and institutional religions, and the birth of a new form of religiosity that is intimate, bodily, personal, and yet still archetypal. And though it may lack the coherence of dogma, it possesses the vitality of immediacy, for the psyche no longer waits for priests or prophets to deliver symbols from on high, but generates them directly, inscribes them directly, and in this democratization lies both danger and promise. For without shared symbols, culture risks fragmentation, but with overly rigid symbols, culture suffocates, and perhaps it is precisely in this proliferation of tattoos, each unique yet archetypally resonant, that we witness the attempt of the unconscious to strike a new balance, to weave a pluralistic tapestry of meaning that honors individuality without dissolving the archetypal foundation. And so the tattooed skin becomes a site of negotiation for the future of myth itself, a living laboratory where the psyche experiments with new forms of meaning. And we must recognize that this is not the first time the body has borne such weight, for in the ancient world the body was always inscribed, whether through ritual scars, paint, jewelry, or clothing, and only in the modern era did the myth retreat into texts and doctrines, abandoning the body as a site of revelation. And now, with Gen Z, the myth returns to the body, as if to remind us that spirit and flesh are not opposites but partners, that the divine always required incarnation, and thus the tattoo is a sacrament of embodiment, a recognition that meaning must be lived, carried, suffered, not merely believed abstractly. And this turn to embodiment coincides with the larger crisis of disembodiment in our time. For we live increasingly in virtual spaces, dislocated from the rhythms of nature, mediated by screens, detached from the immediacy of the earth and the flesh, and the psyche, sensing the danger of dissociation, insists on counterbalancing this drift by marking the body, reasserting the reality of flesh, blood, and permanence. And in this sense, every tattoo is a protest against digital abstraction, an anchor in the real, a reminder that the body still matters, that the soul must be incarnated if it is to be whole. And here we glimpse the myth being born, a myth of re-embodiment, of resacralization of matter, of reconciliation between digital and flesh. And the tattoos of Gen Z are its early expressions, half conscious, half formed, yet brimming with the energy of a new archetypal configuration. And this new myth, if it is too mature, must integrate the opposites that now torment us: permanence and impermanence, individuality and collectivity, body and spirit, digital and material. And in the tattoo we see the image of such integration, permanence achieved through pain, individuality expressed through universal archetypes, the body made sacred through aesthetic symbol, and perhaps even the digital reconciled with the material. For tattoos often borrow from online images, memes, and icons, translating them into flesh, embodying the virtual, grounding it in skin. And in this way, the tattoo becomes a mediator between worlds, between the disembodied flux of the internet and the enduring solidity of the body, between the ancient unconscious and the contemporary self. And this mediatory function is precisely what symbols are meant to accomplish. For they bridge opposites, they reconcile contradictions, they provide a third term where the ego sees only duality. And thus tattoos, in their strange mixture of frivolity and profundity, irony and reverence, become symbols of symbols, mirrors of our time's paradox. And though they may not yet cohere into a grand myth, they foreshadow it. And the task of consciousness is to read these signs, to listen to what the unconscious is saying through them, to recognize in them the seeds of the coming story, and perhaps even to guide this story with greater awareness. For myth, though it arises from depths beyond the ego, can be shaped by how we receive it. And if we dismiss tattoos as meaningless, we risk leaving the archetypes unattended, where they may fester and distort. But if we honor them as symbols, engage them reflectively, and integrate them into a larger vision, we may cooperate with the unconscious in forging a myth adequate to our age. And in this sense, the tattoos of Gen Z are not only personal statements, but collective oracles, whispering of what must come, warning of what is at stake, urging us toward wholeness. And if we fail to hear them, we will miss the myth speaking in our midst. But if we attend, we may discover that these symbols, etched in ink, are the very hieroglyphs of a new era, that the skin of a generation has become the manuscript of the collective unconscious, and that through these living texts we are being invited into a new covenant between body and spirit, between conscious and unconscious, between the ephemeral and the eternal. And in this covenant lies the hope that the human soul, even in an age of fragmentation, may yet find